As we spend today exploring digital society, education is undeniably one of the most important aspects of that society. From COVID putting learning into a virtual environment, the changing skill needs of employers around the world are seeking to close the gap in global education. The world has continued to see changing demands and disruption in the learning sector, and technology has facilitated a step change there. Today, we have the distinct pleasure of being joined by a panel of leading disruptors in what's forecast to be a $10 trillion industry in the next decade. I'm Sam Shaw, Global Head of Software and Services at Macquarie Capital, and today I'm joined by Simon Allen, CEO of McGraw-Hill Education, Marnix Brewer, co-founder and CEO of Studoku, Frank Britt, CEO of Penn Foster, and Alex Burke, CEO of Education Perfect. If you have any questions for Simon, Marnix, Frank, or Alex, please add them to the Q&A box at the bottom of the player. Welcome to you all. As we start off, Simon, obviously in an important few weeks in the history of McGraw-Hill, the company's got such a rich history with over 130 years, in the making in some respects, and quite a few dramatic changes over that time. Perhaps you can put the latest developments into context and how the dramatic change, has impacted the industry over the last few years, and maybe specifically McGraw-Hill.
Yeah, happy to, Sam, and thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to joining the panelists here. I would say for McGraw-Hill, we're at that lovely intersection of great content and brilliant technology, and where the two combine to make sure that we're providing students and teachers the absolute best materials that they can possibly receive to help them through the education journey. Now, for us, as you say, we've got a rich history, 130 plus years, and many people think of us as a textbook publisher, which is fine. But of course, our business has significantly transformed since those days. And now well over half of our business, in fact, just about 3/4 of our business, is now digitally delivered. And the reason is that it's a more elegant way, it's a more inclusive way of improving education from both the student perspective and their outcomes, how well they do, but it's also very, very helpful for the teachers because they've got far much more flexibility in the way they assess the students, the way they can intervene if problems may arise. And for us, to your question, the last few years have been very changeable, particularly the last year, but it's actually been a decade in the making. This transformation towards digital delivery of education has really been at least a decade or more, but it's been the last couple of years that we've really seen it accelerate because students and teachers are now very, very aware of the benefits of technology. As you and I have talked about a lot recently within higher education in the US, we're looking at over 80%, it's about 82% of students now receive their material digitally. And they receive it often through inclusive access, which makes it available at the lowest possible price point, and it means it's accessible for all students. So we're really, really bullish about how the future will continue to grow digitally. We're absolutely committed to providing the best quality content and the platforms, McGraw-Hill Connect and McGraw-Hill ALEX, to make sure that we give students everything they need to give them the best chances of success.
That's great. That's great, Simon. And maybe turning to Marnix really quickly, obviously McGraw with a 130-year history, you're sort of in the first decade, since the company's inception. And so being the youngest company on this panel and on the virtual stage today, when you look at sort of the disruptive factors and the impetus for founding Studoku, what were those, and what have you seen in the market in terms of, evolution through the company's young history?
Yeah, well, for us, what we noticed, especially in 2013, I was studying myself. I saw that there was something missing where students could easily share knowledge with each other. And to be more precise, it was both on the end of pure the documents like study guides, summaries, lecture notes, these kind of things. And also in answering each other's questions, which students have a lot, and they actually help each other a lot outside of the classrooms, let's say. That's where we actually started solving this issue by tackling the first problem, where it was easy to find your study resources and share those with the others. Because in the days where I was preparing for my exams, it took me literally a few days to get all the knowledge I needed before I could really start studying for my exams. That's why we launched this platform where students can easily go to. They share their own documents, but they can, of course, also start using the others, which have been shared previously by other students. Now, a few years later, we're also busy with the second problem, let's say. So we're now focusing more and more on the community part, where not only sharing the knowledge, but actually also asking each other questions and getting the answers to it is sort of the new feature set we offer. Aside from that, if you're really in a lot of struggle, which happens a lot as well, you could, for example, also easily find a tutor who can help you out. And back in my days, let's say, I mean, it's not that long ago, but still, I am graduated by now. But at that moment, when I needed help from a tutor, I really had to sort of post a note somewhere in the library, like, can somebody help me out with some mathematics? Where for us, it's now much easier to connect these students, given that they're all at one platform.
Interesting. No, thank you. Maybe turning to Frank quickly, as we think about disruption for Penn Foster, that's really sort of disruption, not even in the broader context, but in, kind of the workforce context and the upskilling context. And, given what Penn Foster does in terms of its ability to enable students to flexibly access education, to fit in with lifestyle, to fit in with budget, to fit in with, career aspirations. We're at such an interesting inflection point in the global economy in terms of upskilling. I mean, what are you seeing as the growing areas of need in the economy, and how is Penn Foster impacting that?
Well, as you know, Sam, we're among the largest middle skilled focused job platforms in the country. We serve about 300,000 working adults a year. And the jobs that we are focused on, we refer to them as across the color spectrum, which is there are green jobs, there are gray jobs, there are pink jobs being healthcare, green jobs being environmental. And what we're preoccupied with is helping about half the US workforce, about 80 million working adults who are not aspiring to have four-year degrees, make sure that they can sustain employment success over the years ahead. And so we're preoccupied with what are those jobs of the present and the future that are emerging. What's interesting is if you think about what a job is, if you sort of atomize it, it's really just a collection of skills. And what's interesting about it, if you did a time-lapse photography view, is that there are jobs that are still called the same things, where the anatomy of those jobs has changed because the skills have changed. And in some cases, there's inventions of new jobs. And so it's actually a complicated question to figure out when is a new job, and when is an old job refreshed, and what are the requirements to help a person stay relevant in that career path. The second observation we'd make beyond trying to help people maintain the right kind of employment for their success is that one of the challenges of being particularly the middle skilled workforce, in contrast to higher ed and particularly like elite MBA programs, if you go to Harvard Business School, the signal to noise ratio is perfect because there's like 15 jobs you'll get, you have unlimited demand. It's almost like you're deciding what to do because you have perfect line of sight to what your options are. As you get deeper into the workforce system, the signal and the noise change a lot, and it gets a lot noisy with a lot less signal. And so what we're trying to do is to help people navigate that noise because the system itself is set up in a very siloed, fragmented way. The support systems are fragmented, the data pools are fragmented across the workforce world and alike. And we're trying to connect for the consumer, the learner, the full architecture of what their needs are. So we acquired recently the largest career discovery platform in the United States, which we're now connecting to the largest workforce development platform. And then you don't have to be a strategist to figure out the third leg of the stool would be connecting that to the predictive elements of employment. And so this idea of emerging as the primary partner for helping people sustain and renew their career success, which is bigger than just upskilling. It's the full continuum of the journey of career management. We think there's a massive unmet need in the market for that. And consumers are hungry for those types of solutions that connect. And we have a lot of work ahead, but that's what we're trying to do, build that community of middle skilled workers to give them the economic mobility that they pursue in whatever geography and whatever occupational area that they perceive to be the best for their lives and for their families.
That's great. Fascinating. I think kind of move to Alex for a second. What's interesting is obviously, many of the aspects of what, Simon Marnix, and Frank addresses is sort of the higher education, continuing education, realm. Education Perfect is obviously, had those similar types of impacts from a technology disruption perspective, but in the K-12 realm, and particularly in ANZ and in Asia. As you talk about virtual learning, the shift toward that in that part of the world, how do you see the demand dynamics changing there? How do you approach it? How has Education Perfect, been able to kind of make such a deep impact?
Yeah, I guess, firstly, the profile of digital tech within classroom has clearly been accelerated due to COVID and schools being disrupted. I think what we've seen is that, firstly, a lot of schools actually weren't ready when COVID hit, and a lot of those schools the reality is, some teachers hadn't even used a Zoom call before, and we're trying to get used to a lot of digital tools. So it's very clear that they're early on their digital transformation journey. And there was also quite a mixed match for equitable access. So there was a lot. What we saw was a lot of schools didn't have one-to-one devices, and there were students as well that didn't even have broadband at home. And I've heard stories of that all over the world. So there was a big access difference. And in terms of how we responded and how we've worked, it's important for us that we're solving points of pain, meeting user needs within teachers in classroom. And I think for us it's a change management piece, really. It's a hand holding of teachers to get them used to the digital tools and demonstrate the value of how data can help with differentiated learning, and how through sort of auto marking it can save them time, and just really sort of hand hold them through the process of using tech within the classroom.
And then maybe opening it up to all of you, clearly at this tech summit, we're focused on using technology, not just even in the developed world, but also, as a tool or a mode for, upgrading skills or opportunity sets within the developing world in low and middle income countries. And it's an acute, issue or sensitivity because, with as many half of 10-year-olds, not being able to read age appropriate text, if all of you or some of you had a view, what more, in your opinion, can we be doing, either individually or through our companies or collectively to address the global education gap?
Yeah, Sam, I would say that, and just to echo Alex's point, studies we did across the US, barely 37% of students actually had daily access to digital devices in K-12. That's incredibly low. That's very, very sad. That creates the problem right there of inequity. And that's what we've got to make sure that we shift. Thankfully, now post-pandemic, that number is now about 73%, but it still has a long way to go to really improve. And I think, to your point, when you look at 10-year-olds, doesn't really matter what the age is. I think part of the problem has been that we've been quite obsessed of reading grade levels or creating material that is aligned to a certain age or grade level. Whereas we're more interested now, and we should be more interested now, in assessing the student performance and understanding, regardless of their age, and making sure that we can then provide age-appropriate material, particularly in reading and math, to really help them close a gap that may be there. And as Sam, as you know, we created something at McGraw-Hill Rise, it's called, that really helped teachers understand what is the gap, the COVID gap, as it was referred to a few months ago. And we found that it was, 6 to 12 months of problematic reading regression, math regression in how they were trying to learn. And the biggest thing you have to do is understand, what is that gap? At what level are they? So the ability for us to create intervention tools to assess where students are, at that point we can go forward, create the right materials delivered in the right way to close the gap as quickly as possible. The age is less important, but the level of attainment is what's key. And that's where technology gives us a huge advantage.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges, I think, is that, with the current system, it's very hard to have a sort of real-time view, really, of what's happening. And I think that's the massive opportunity for technology, in that if you could give teachers that data-first mindset by giving them, true data around how a student's progressing, students' engagement, then you can intervene and help them with those pathways. And I think that's the sort of true power of a sort of blended classroom environment, really. The combination of then technology helping and aiding a teacher interact with their student and push them into the right direction to help their grades.
No, that's extremely helpful. And then maybe, Marnix and Frank, for you, before we open it up to the audience questions, looking forward, what technologies would you say most excite you as you look at the future of education?
Yeah,
I think in our case, thank you, Marcus. I think in our case, we are excited about the core innovations that are happening in education. However, we think there's two essential adjacencies that I think will drive even greater alpha. We are, as you know, Sam, one of our financial sponsors is one of the largest hedge funds in the world. And the reason we agreed that they would be good partners is because their history, of course, is to use data, machine learning, and alike to drive alpha in financial markets. And we believe that there's significant opportunity to apply those same principles to human capital in the same way they've done it for financial capital. And I think the notion that education is going to self-invent the ability to drive outsized insights on consumer learners in and of themselves, I think is an incomplete view. I think you're going to have to find best of breed industries that are masters of using data to drive outsized outcomes. And you need to inculcate that into the education sector. And so, we believe that non-traditional providers like hedge funds can actually be quite helpful to driving better student outcomes. The second framing that we view is that the blurring of the distinction between ed tech and job tech. If you look in the last 5 years, Sam, as you know, the majority of the funding in the combining of ed tech and job tech sectors has actually been in job tech. It's like 90% of the total funding. And so we think that the innovations that are ahead have to do with predictive employment. If you sort of put your 5 years from today hat on a minute, you might say, wouldn't you want to enroll in a program that you have a super high correlation to outcome of employment with certainty? And in order to make that claim and then to have it play out, you need to have a very sophisticated view on the whole question of discovery, learning, and then placement. And so we think there's a lot of innovation in the application of data as it relates to matching to employment, particularly, again, in the middle skilled, where the signal to noise is a lot noisier than if you go to Harvard Business School, where it's almost perfect. And we think there's a lot of opportunity to bring new types of technologies from within and outside the sector to help make employment predictability a natural complement and extension of all the innovation that has to happen within the core learning itself.
Yeah, in terms of my most exciting technologies from the last 2 years, I think if we have to seek for positive notes of the whole pandemic, I would say that it's super nice to see that educators were actually pushed to start using technologies because education was far behind where when it comes to adoption of technologies in work, let's say. Any company was way further ahead than education was, but COVID pushed everybody to from day to day suddenly to switch all to online services. A lot of new technologies have been developed in the meantime, but there were already quite some very nice technologies being produced, but simply not really used yet. Now with this push, you can actually see finally some better how do you say that? It's more like suddenly they also start adapting to new technologies, and you can see education improve there. Of course, there's a lot to do still, but I mean, it's also very it's very impressive how fast they picked it up actually, and that education could continue. Right now, in terms of the technology I'm looking forward to is actually the examination tools, because right now that's still pretty difficult to have everybody in one classroom taking exams. Also, taking exams in general is also very old-fashioned and haven't changed for the last 2,000 years or perhaps even more. So let's see what happens there. And I think many companies are now busy solving this issue as well, and hopefully educators can adapt to it quickly.
You know what, let me just add, if I may, Marlies, I think you're exactly right. And what's interesting is, to your point, the number of faculty and students that have been forced online and to learn remotely. The great thing is that from what we can tell, they don't want to go back. Once they've been forced in and they understand the benefits and the value and they can see how it works and get the flexibility it provides, the desire to go back to a traditional classroom or print or whatever it may be, that's gone. Once they've made the switch, they've accustomed to it, they've really seen the benefits. It's now downhill from here on. It's very encouraging, I think.
That's great to hear. And so perhaps they needed to push in a way. And
yeah, we needed that. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, in the few minutes we have left, we do have some questions from the audience, that I think are quite compelling, and I'll open it up to all of you. The first being, obviously large cap tech, in terms of Google, Microsoft, et cetera, Salesforce, moving ever so closely, into the ed sector in their own way. What role do you see those players, taking in both K-12 and higher ed, and continuing ed in the next decade?
I think they can be extremely helpful in connecting the teachers with the students. They do an awesome job with stuff like, Zoom as well, of course, with Google Meet, but also the collaboration within documents, the presentations, raising hands, raising questions, doing polls, connecting students in breakout rooms to give some extra lessons, perhaps some tutors who can stay online. There's many to explore there, but I think especially in connecting people from different places in the world.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think in the K-12 space, Google and Microsoft are in a dominant. So it's either either a school uses Google or they use Microsoft. I think when they play to their strengths, there's huge value to schools. And for us and businesses like ourselves, it's important to think about that technology ecosystem and think about how you integrate and play really well and create a really nice experience, a nice seamless experience from, say, Google Classroom to our product that's actually in Classroom, and the businesses that can really make that seamless experience are the ones that are going to do really well in the future years.
Sam, I think another lens on this, which is more of a capitalist view than a student-centric view, and I think to think of myself as student first, is there's an interesting arbitrage opportunity in public and private markets. If you look at the healthcare sector globally, is about $12 trillion, and about 60% of that market is public. If you look at education broadly, it's $6 trillion. but it's less than $1 billion, less than $1 trillion is public. So my point is that in the education sector, it's an underpenetrated category relative to public market access. And so there's an opportunity to arbitrage that, if you will, unrealized public market value. And that's obviously not lost on some of the big players like Microsoft and Google. And I think they are uniquely positioned as a logical adjacency to come in and capture some of that market cap that is not currently available because of the education sector being, if you will, underpenetrated in the public category itself. That's also why you see the catalytic effects of SPACs and things like that, because you look at the multiples on some of these companies, whether it be Coursera or Chegg or guys like that, they're good companies, but they also are benefited from scarcity. And the public market investors need a portfolio and they need index fund investment, and there's just literally not enough assets to invest in. And so I think that the Googles of the world and the Microsofts and the LinkedIns want to arbitrage part of that. And that's another reason beyond all the student impact, social reasons, that I think you'll see them take an even more aggressive posture relative to EdTech.
Yes, Sam, the only thing I just add, I agree with all of that. I think they've been great enablers. Microsoft and Google have been in the education space for many, many years, and they've been great enablers throughout K-12, higher education, graduate school. We have a lot of respect for how they operate within the sector, the choices they decide to make on what they do from a content perspective, how they think about delivering, how they think about engaging with the students directly, or the institutions where they've tended to focus in some cases. That's going to be interesting to track and to watch. But they've been a very good additive to the whole process of education because of what they've enabled.
And you all touched on it a little bit in the last few minutes we have here. So much of what we're talking about, in a technology context is also impact driven. And obviously no larger part of society that's impactful than education. As being players in the private sector, beyond just obviously the capital, and Frankie touched on a little bit, in just impact on society, what would be the one suggestion that each of you would have on the expansion the private sector could play, in terms of making an impact?
I think one issue we haven't talked about is actually the home situation of the students right now. I mean, I'm not sure, of course, how long it will take until we're actually back in the classrooms physically with packed classrooms, let's say. But in the meantime, students have to stay at home, studying from there, and some have a spare room where they can have the quietness and the space to actually focus on the studies, where some actually live in a much smaller house, perhaps with 4 other brothers and sisters, not having that time to actually concentrate on the study field. So perhaps the private sector, with a lot of space, large offices, probably empty, etc., can actually offer some space to work at safe distance and help these kids study and have the room to actually concentrate on their studies.
I think that consumers are increasingly discerning regarding the value systems of the enterprises they want to partner with as learners. And I think that we all have a very important role in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. And I think that our institution, and I think many others, has to look a lot more like the people we serve and has to have a different kind of engagement with that population. There are millions of people who have insufficient voice, that are underrepresented and need advocacy. And I think that this idea, like it's everyone's on the outside looking in, is an interesting dynamic, because actually most people feel they're on the outside. So the majority is the outsider rather than the majority being the insider. And I think education institutions in particular have a unique opportunity and role to do what they can to democratize opportunity and to elevate people who don't have the same privilege that a lot of us have had. And I think that the companies that do best at that will, A, do well for the world, and B, I think they'll just be better organizations. They'll attract better people. They'll more progressive investors. And I think ultimately, if we all align around that idea of diversity, equity, inclusion earnestly, I think we can have an outsized catalytic effect on making sure that the world's a fairer, better, and ultimately more competitive place.
Yeah, I'd agree with Frank. I think the equitable access point is definitely a gap, and is definitely somewhere something that the private sector can really help support. The other thing I think that is changing is that curriculums are changing, future of work. I think there's more that the private sector could do at grassroots level, and as sort of schools change and how learning changes, there are opportunities for those sort of organisations to really add value and help that sort of grassroots system, and improve people's opportunities going forward.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for the time. I would just close by saying, as we look forward and, as what you've heard today, each of these companies is forging the path forward and what education will look like over the next decade. And what's most unique about them is that despite where they are in their life cycles and scales that they've achieved, they're still finding ways to innovate each and every day. And so thank you again, Simon, Alex, Frank, Marnix, and appreciate your interest and appreciate the audience interest as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam.
No problem. Thanks.